Alongside the personal grief that all my family are feeling, we also share with so many of you in the United Kingdom.
There are moments in history when the grandest of institutions, the ones built on centuries of tradition, duty, and sacrifice, are shaken not by war, not by scandal from outside, but by something far more personal. Something that cuts through marble corridors and gilded ceilings and lands right at the heart of a family. What unfolded inside Buckingham Palace in the spring of 2025 was exactly that kind of moment. And when the dust finally settled, nothing would ever look quite the same again. This is the story of a secret that traveled from the cold vaults of royal history straight into the hands of someone who was never supposed to touch it. It is a story about loyalty, about legacy, and about what happens when the person sitting closest to the throne forgets what the crown truly means. Stay with us, because every detail matters, and the ending is something no one saw coming. To understand what happened, you have to first understand what Queen Elizabeth II left behind. When Her Majesty passed away in September 2022, she did not simply leave behind a nation in mourning. She left behind a lifetime's worth of accumulated history. Letters written in her own hand, brooches worn at state funerals, pearl necklaces that had graced her neck during the most somber and celebrated moments of the 20th century. These were not merely possessions. They were artifacts. Living pieces of British history, as significant in their own quiet way as any document preserved in the National Archives or displayed behind museum glass. By royal tradition stretching back across generations, the personal belongings of a departed monarch are placed under the protection of the Royal Collection Trust. They are sealed, catalogued with meticulous precision, and secured for a period approaching nearly a century. Not to be distributed, claimed, gifted, or released until the formally appointed time arrives. This is not a suggestion. It is not a guideline open to interpretation. It is a sovereign statute, a legal and ceremonial obligation that every single member of the royal household understands from the very moment they enter its orbit. The treasures of a queen belong not to her surviving family alone. They belong to history itself. They belong to the nation. And they belong to the generations yet to come, who will one day stand before them in wonder. And yet, someone had apparently decided that history could wait. That the rules applied to everyone, except them. It was on a quiet Tuesday morning in early May 2025 when the alarm was first sounded. Not publicly, not with fanfare or flashing cameras, but in the tightly controlled and carefully managed world behind palace gates, where whispers carry far more weight than any headline ever could. Donald Walton, the royal treasurer, a meticulous and deeply experienced man with 3 full decades of dedicated service behind him, arrived at Buckingham Palace carrying a report that made the color drain from every face it reached. Items were missing from the royal archive. Not just any items. Not things that could be dismissed as misplaced or overlooked in a routine audit. Among the pieces that were unaccounted for was the sapphire Jubilee brooch, a breathtaking and irreplaceable piece of royal jewelry that the late Queen had worn with quiet pride during her 65th year on the throne, one of the most instantly recognizable and frequently photographed brooches in the entire history of the British monarchy. Also missing was the double-strand pearl necklace that Her Majesty had worn at Princess Diana's funeral in 1997, an image burned so deeply into the collective memory of an entire generation that it required no caption, no explanation, no context. People simply knew it. And then there were the journals, private, handwritten, never before seen by any member of the public, which the Queen had kept during the long, difficult, and deeply isolating months of the COVID-19 lockdown. Inside those pages, according to those few privileged individuals who had known of their existence, were letters written directly to her heirs. Words meant to outlast her. Words that were now simply gone. The palace, in an instant, ceased to be the calm and composed and magnificently dignified institution that it always presented to the outside world. Behind those famous iron gates, panic was quietly spreading. Controlled, yes, but unmistakable to anyone who knew where to look and what to listen for. Prince William and Princess Anne were the first senior royals to be fully briefed on the situation. They convened immediately with Donald Walton, who despite his best professional efforts appeared visibly shaken and considerably pale. He swore to them, with every ounce of sincerity he possessed, that everything had been in perfect order during his last full inspection of the archive. The entry logs were clean. The seals had shown absolutely no sign of tampering. The security monitors had recorded nothing unusual. And yet, 3 of the most irreplaceable and historically significant items in the entire royal archive were simply no longer where they were supposed to be. Prince William pressed him firmly for answers. Princess Anne pressed him with even greater intensity, her voice carrying the particular sharpness that those who know her have learned to take very seriously. But the treasurer had no answers that satisfied either of them. He had only his records, his bewilderment, and his unimpeachable loyalty to the crown, none of which, as useful as they were, could explain where those items had gone or how they had gotten there. By the time the full report finally reached King Charles, the matter had already taken on the unmistakable dimensions of something far more serious and far more dangerous than a simple inventory discrepancy or an administrative oversight. Charles received the news in his private study. He rose from his leather armchair slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a man carrying considerably more than the weight of his years. He said very little at first. He crossed the room without speaking. He stood at the tall window looking out over the palace grounds, and the silence in the room grew heavy with meaning. Then, in a voice that carried all the quiet and unmistakable authority of someone who had spent the better part of a lifetime preparing for exactly this kind of moment, he finally spoke. "This is not about objects," he said, his words measured and precise. "This is not about jewelry or journals or any item sitting in any vault. This is about my mother's legacy, and I will not allow it to be treated carelessly by anyone." He called for a private council that same evening. He called for an immediate private investigation to run alongside the official inquiry. And he personally summoned Sir Clement Mallister, one of the most trusted, most experienced, and most quietly formidable royal security directors in the institution's entire modern history, to lead the private investigation himself, reporting to no one except the king. The private council met that same evening in the royal war room, a secure chamber used historically for the most sensitive discussions imaginable. Around the table sat Prince William, Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and Queen Camilla. The atmosphere was tense and the conversation was careful. King Charles laid out the known facts plainly and methodically, and then he asked each of them for their perspective. It was Camilla who first suggested that they seriously consider whether Donald Walton himself might have had some involvement in the disappearance. Perhaps not acting alone, perhaps operating under some form of pressure or inducement from outside, but that the angle was too obvious to be dismissed without examination. Prince William nodded and agreed that it was a legitimate angle worth pursuing properly. Princess Anne pushed back against the idea with considerable force, reminding the room of a deeply painful episode from decades earlier in which a false and carelessly made accusation had come close to destroying the career and the reputation of a completely innocent man. Prince Edward supported his sister's call for caution. King Charles listened carefully to all of it. When everyone had spoken, he made his decision. 2 separate investigations would run simultaneously, the official Treasury inquiry proceeding through its established channels, and a private royal probe reporting exclusively and directly to him. Sir Clement would lead the latter with complete authority, complete resources, and absolute discretion. What no one seated around that table understood in that moment, what none of them could have known, was that the answer they were all searching for was not hidden somewhere beyond the palace walls. It had been inside those walls the entire time. It was, in a very real sense, already in the room with them. Sir Clement Mallister was not a man who panicked, not under any circumstances. He had navigated intelligence crises of international significance. He had operated in environments where a single wrong decision could carry consequences measured not in damaged careers but in human lives. And so when he accepted the royal investigation, he approached it precisely the way he had always approached every challenge that had come before it. Methodically, without rushing, and entirely without assumptions about where the evidence might eventually lead him. His team conducted thorough interviews with every member of the Treasury staff without exception. They reviewed every entry log for the preceding 3 months, every duty roster, every security checkpoint record, every maintenance report. They found nothing that immediately suggested wrongdoing. No alarms had triggered during the relevant period. No unauthorized entry had been flagged by the system. No equipment had malfunctioned. The paperwork was immaculate and consistent throughout. Which, as any investigator with real experience fully understands, is itself a kind of answer. Records that are too clean, too perfect, too consistent are often that way for a deliberate reason. It was on the 7th night of the investigation, well past 2 o'clock in the morning, that the breakthrough finally came, and it came not from a senior officer with decades of experience, not from an advanced piece of surveillance technology, but from a young junior analyst named Donna, who was sitting cross-legged on the cold concrete floor of the archive hall with a laptop balanced carefully on her knees, cross-referencing guard duty logs against official shift schedules going back nearly 2 full months. She noticed something. A single entry for the morning of April 27th. A guard named Robert Halton had clocked in at 3:49 in the morning. His shift was not scheduled to begin until 6 a.m. There was no early arrival notification filed with the duty supervisor. There was no authorization from anyone senior. There was no closing entry at the end of his time on the floor. There was nothing. Just the timestamp of his arrival, sitting quietly in the official record like a small stone dropped into a still and dark body of water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Clement studied the entry. He studied it for a very long time without speaking. "Wake everyone up," he said at last, his voice quieter than usual. "We have our lead." Robert Halton had 10 full years of unblemished service to the royal household behind him. His personnel record was clean in every respect. During the initial sweep of interviews conducted in the first days of the investigation, he had said nothing that raised any concern or triggered any follow-up. But that had been before Donna found his log entry. Before Clement had something specific and concrete to bring into the room with him. When Halton was brought in for a second interview, quietly, without any formal announcement, without any official charge being filed, he was clearly a different man from the composed and cooperative guard who had spoken to the first team. He sat across from Clement and Donna in a bare and deliberately simple room, and it took less than 15 minutes of careful, measured, methodical questioning before everything he had been holding inside himself began to surface. He told them everything, and he told it in the halting, exhausted, shame-filled voice of a man who had been carrying a terrible weight for weeks, and had been waiting, perhaps without fully knowing it, for the moment when he could finally set it down. He had received a phone call. Before dawn. An unregistered number that appeared on his screen with no name attached. The voice on the other end of that call had known things it had no business knowing. His full name, his precise shift rotation, the name of the school his young daughter attended every morning. The voice had offered him money. Not a small amount. Enough money, Halton said, his voice cracking in the quiet of the interview room, to cover his wife's cancer treatments, the treatments that had been consuming his family's savings month after month for over a year, treatments they were beginning to fear they could no longer afford to continue. And the voice had told him, clearly and with apparent confidence, that the instruction was fully sanctioned, that it was a royal order coming from someone with the authority to issue it, that he was simply facilitating an internal transfer of property, nothing more than that, and that no record needed to be made of it because the instruction itself superseded normal protocol. He had believed them. Or perhaps, desperate, exhausted, and quietly terrified for the woman he loved, he had chosen to believe them because the alternative was too painful to face. Either way, before the sun rose on April 27th, he had entered the vault and removed the items he had been instructed to remove. He had placed them exactly where he was told to place them, and he had walked away, telling himself that what he had done was not wrong because someone with authority had told him it was right. Clement asked to see the call log from that morning without any hesitation. Halton handed over his personal phone immediately. The number was there, exactly as he had described, unregistered, untraceable by the conventional methods available to most investigators. But Clement's team was not limited to conventional methods. They traced the origin point of the call using GPS location data tied to the device that had placed it. The call had originated from inside Buckingham Palace itself. The realization settled over Sir Clement like cold water poured slowly down his spine. This was not an external operation. This was not some clever outside actor who had somehow identified a gap in palace security and exploited it from a safe distance. This was someone on the inside. Someone with detailed knowledge of the Treasury's internal procedures and scheduling. Someone with the technical means to use an unregistered device from within the palace. And someone with enough knowledge of Robert Halton's personal circumstances to know exactly which lever to pull to make him comply without asking too many questions. Clement went directly to the king. Charles received everything Clement had to tell him in complete and absolute silence, not interrupting once. When Clement finished speaking, the king sat still for a long moment. Then he asked one question, and only one. "You are certain of this?" "Tracked and confirmed, Your Majesty. No breach in the trace, no margin for error." The king turned away from him and stood at the window of his private study, looking out at the palace grounds in the long golden light of the late afternoon, and the silence between them stretched until it felt like something solid. When Charles finally turned back, his expression had settled into something that was neither anger nor grief exactly, but something that contained elements of both, compressed beneath a surface of complete and unwavering resolve. "Search every residence," he said quietly. "Do it discreetly, using trusted household staff. Give them every reason to come forward if they find anything. And let no one outside this circle know what we are looking for or why." That evening, the king gathered the most trusted members of the royal household staff, personal maids, valets, private attendants with years of loyal service, in the lower chamber of the East Wing. He addressed them not as a sovereign issuing a command to subordinates but as a son who was grieving something that had been taken from his mother and asking for help in recovering it. "My mother spent her entire life in service to this country and to all of you," he told them, his voice carrying a steadiness that those who were present would later describe as deeply moving. "What has been taken from her belongs not to any one person. It belongs to our shared history. If you find anything at all, in the course of carrying out your duties, I ask you to bring it to Sir Clement directly. Your loyalty in this matter will be remembered, and it will be honored." The search lasted 48 hours. Every chamber was covered without exception. Every wardrobe examined, every drawer assessed, every private and personal space moved through with quiet and respectful thoroughness. And then, on the evening of Sunday, May 14th, a maid named Eleanor Hartridge came forward to speak with Sir Clement. She had been assigned to Camilla's private wing during the search. Moving through the chambers that had been used by members of Camilla's family during a recent visit to the palace, she had found something inside a small decorative jewelry box, one shaped like a rabbit, sitting at the very back of a wardrobe in a room that had been used by Camilla's young granddaughter Eliza. Inside the box was the sapphire Jubilee brooch. Eleanor had brought it immediately and directly to Sir Clement, carrying it with gloved hands. Her own hands, she told him afterward, had not stopped shaking the entire way there. The item was authenticated within the hour. And within that same hour, Clement's technical team confirmed what the evidence had already begun to point toward clearly and unmistakably. The device that had been used to place the call to Robert Halton in the pre-dawn hours of April 27th, the unregistered phone, the one whose signal had originated from somewhere inside the palace, had been active in a location within Camilla's private residential wing. The same wing where Eleanor had found the brooch hidden in a child's jewelry box. Every line of the investigation had converged on a single point. King Charles summoned Camilla to his private chamber that same evening. Sir Clement and Donna were present. The sapphire Jubilee brooch sat on a velvet tray in the center of the table between them, its deep blue stones catching and holding the light. Camilla entered the room with the composure of someone who had spent years learning to walk into difficult situations without showing the world what was happening beneath the surface. She looked at the brooch sitting on the velvet tray. She looked at Charles. And she did not flinch. Not at first. She said immediately that it was a setup. That someone was deliberately trying to damage her family's reputation within the institution. That this kind of hostility and suspicion had been an undercurrent running through her entire time as a member of the royal family. A quiet, persistent, never fully acknowledged resistance to accepting her and those connected to her as genuinely belonging within the palace's inner circle. She said it with conviction. She said it with the practiced and formidable poise of a woman who had weathered decades of public criticism and press hostility and emerged from all of it still standing. But the evidence before her was not the press. It was not public opinion or tabloid speculation. It was specific, technically verified, and resting in front of her on a velvet tray. Sir Clement laid everything out for her plainly and without embellishment. The unregistered phone. The GPS location data placing the device in her wing. The brooch found hidden in her granddaughter's room. The testimony of Robert Halton. The complete and documented timeline from the early hours of April 27th to the moment of discovery. And eventually, under the weight of all of it, Camilla's composure shifted. Not into tears. Not into remorse. Into something else entirely. Something that surprised even those who thought they knew her well. It shifted into justification. "I did not steal it," she said, her voice remaining steady and her posture remaining straight. "I took what was promised to me." She told them that during her lifetime, Queen Elizabeth had personally indicated to Camilla that certain pieces from her collection would eventually come to her. That the sapphire brooch specifically had been mentioned in those private conversations. That she had simply been trying to honor a promise that the formal archival process, with its century-long waiting period, was preventing from ever being properly fulfilled. She pointed to jewelry from Diana's collection that had passed to Catherine, Princess of Wales. She pointed to various other distributions of royal property that had been made quietly and without the same scrutiny over the years since the Queen's passing. "Why should I wait 100 years, she asked, "for something I was personally told was meant for me?" The room was completely silent after she finished speaking. No one moved. The air itself seemed to have grown heavier. Charles looked at her for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no heat in it, no visible anger. Only the deep and unmistakable weight of a decision already fully formed and already final. "Because it was not yours to decide," he said. "Not alone. Not in secret. Not by calling a frightened man before dawn and using his family's suffering as the instrument of your plan." What followed was swift and, by the centuries-old standards of a monarchy that has always moved with the careful pace of history rather than the urgency of the moment, almost startling in its decisiveness. King Charles convened a formal gathering of the senior royal household. Standing before those assembled, he spoke clearly and without hesitation. Effective immediately, Camilla would be relieved of her ceremonial duties. Her formal titles and official roles would be reviewed and curtailed. Any future claim, by herself or by any member of her family, on royal property, heirlooms, or items held in the royal archive would be suspended indefinitely and without exception. The matter would be handled with every measure of discretion that the institution could preserve, but the principles at stake were too fundamental and too important to be answered with silence. "This monarchy," he told them, his voice carrying the full gravity of the moment, "has endured because it has always been built on trust, on duty, on the understanding that what belongs to the crown belongs to the nation and to history, not to any single individual, however closely they stand to the throne. The moment we allow that principle to be treated as negotiable, we begin the process of losing everything that has kept this institution standing through centuries of upheaval and change. That is not something I am willing to permit. Not for anyone." The missing items were returned to the vault. Robert Halton, whose cooperation with the investigation had proven essential and whose desperate personal circumstances had made him uniquely vulnerable to manipulation, was dealt with separately, quietly and with genuine consideration for what he and his family had endured. And Buckingham Palace, as it always has done throughout its long and turbulent history, presented a composed and dignified face to the outside world, even as everything behind those famous gates had shifted in ways that would take years, perhaps decades, to fully reckon with. There is something deeply and uncomfortably human about this story, beneath all its grandeur and ceremony and historical weight. At its core, stripped of the palace corridors and the velvet trays and the centuries of protocol, it is simply a story about the difficulty of waiting. about the particular frustration of being promised something and then watching time and tradition and institutional process place it forever just beyond your reach. About the temptation, which is not unique to queens or kings or anyone who has ever lived inside a palace, to simply reach out and take what feels, in the deepest and most private part of yourself, like something that was already yours. But institutions are not held together by what any individual privately believes they deserve. They are held together by agreed limits, by the willingness of every person within them, regardless of their rank or their proximity to power, to defer to something larger than their own desire. The moment those limits become negotiable, the moment someone decides that the rules apply to everyone except themselves, the entire structure becomes fragile in ways that are difficult to repair. King Charles understood that. He had perhaps always understood it, shaped and formed by a lifetime spent watching his mother model exactly that kind of restraint, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, without ever asking for recognition or reward for the sacrifices it required. The sapphire brooch would return to the vault. It would continue to wait, exactly as it had always been meant to. And the monarchy, tested in a way it had not been tested in years, shaken in its private corridors even if the world outside saw only dignity, would continue as well.